What if I told you that Switzerland carved nuclear-proof bunkers deep inside the Alps to hide 4.5 million seed varieties that could be humanity's last hope against global agricultural collapse? It sounds like doomsday preparation, right? Well, Switzerland actually built this genetic fortress. And the reason why will shock you. This mountain seed vault has already saved crops worth billions of dollars and could determine whether humanity survives the next century of climate change. But here's what makes this story truly mind-blowing. The seeds hidden beneath alpine granite represent the genetic difference between civilization and starvation for future generations. Picture this. You're descending through multiple security checkpoints into the heart of a Swiss mountain, passing through blast doors designed to withstand nuclear explosions. The elevator drops 200 meters through solid alpine granite rock that has remained stable for millions of years. When the doors open, you enter a climate-controlled facility that looks like something from a science fiction movie. Row upon row of sealed containers stretch into the distance, each containing thousands of seed samples from around the world. The temperature is maintained at exactly 18 degrees C, creating conditions where seeds can remain viable for centuries. Humidity is controlled to prevent any moisture that could damage genetic material. The air is filtered and recycled to eliminate contaminants. But these aren't ordinary seeds. Each sample represents unique genetic traits that have evolved over thousands of years: resistance to drought, tolerance for extreme temperatures, ability to grow in poor soils, natural immunity to plant diseases. Together, they contain the genetic diversity that modern agriculture has lost through decades of industrial farming focused on just a few high-yield varieties. The scale is absolutely staggering. The Alpine Seed Vault stores genetic material from over 4.5 million crop varieties, representing virtually every food plant that humans have ever cultivated. The collection includes 150,000 varieties of wheat, 200,000 types of rice, 50,000 different potato varieties, and thousands of fruit, vegetable, and grain species that most people have never heard of. Each seed sample is stored in multiple locations within the vault to prevent loss from accidents or equipment failures. Backup samples are stored in identical facilities in other countries, creating a global network of genetic preservation that ensures no variety can be lost forever. The redundancy systems exceed those used for protecting nuclear weapons or state secrets. But perhaps most remarkably, this isn't just a museum of agricultural history. It's an active resource that's already saving modern agriculture from disasters that threaten global food security. The vault has provided seeds that rescued crops worth billions of dollars when diseases, droughts, and climate changes threatened to destroy entire harvests. The Swiss facility is part of a global network that's becoming humanity's insurance policy against agricultural catastrophe. Similar vaults in Norway, India, Australia, and 22 other countries create a distributed backup system that could maintain human civilization even if climate change destroys most current agricultural areas. But to understand why Switzerland would build such an elaborate genetic fortress, we need to understand the agricultural crisis that threatens to leave humanity vulnerable to mass starvation. Modern agriculture is built on a foundation of genetic diversity that's disappearing at alarming rates. Over the past century, industrial farming has replaced thousands of traditional crop varieties with just a few high-yield strains that produce consistent harvests under ideal conditions. This genetic simplification has dramatically increased food production, but it's also created vulnerability that could prove catastrophic. The numbers are terrifying. Since 1900, humanity has lost over 75% of agricultural genetic diversity. Of the 7,000 plant species that humans have used for food throughout history, just 30 now provide 95% of all calories consumed worldwide. 3 crops, rice, wheat, and corn, account for 60% of global food energy. This genetic bottleneck means that modern agriculture depends on varieties that are essentially genetic clones, sharing the same vulnerabilities to diseases, pests, and climate variations. When a new pathogen emerges or environmental conditions change, Entire crops can fail simultaneously across vast areas, threatening food security for billions of people. History provides sobering examples of what happens when agricultural genetics become too narrow. The Irish potato famine of the 1840s killed over 1 million people because Irish agriculture depended on just one potato variety that proved vulnerable to a single disease. Similar genetic vulnerabilities caused crop failures that contributed to famines in the Soviet Union, China, and other regions throughout the 20th century. Climate change is making genetic diversity even more critical. As temperatures rise, precipitation patterns shift, and extreme weather becomes more frequent. Crops need genetic traits that allow adaptation to rapidly changing conditions. Traditional varieties often contain genes for drought tolerance, heat resistance, and pest immunity that could be crucial for future agriculture. But these genetic resources are disappearing faster than they can be documented. Traditional farming communities that maintained diverse crop varieties for centuries are adopting modern high-yield varieties and abandoning traditional seeds. Indigenous knowledge about crop management and genetic resources is being lost as rural populations migrate to cities. Seed companies have contributed to genetic erosion by focusing on varieties that perform well with industrial farming methods, but lack the genetic diversity needed for long-term resilience. Patent systems sometimes prevent farmers from saving and sharing seeds, further reducing genetic diversity in agricultural systems. The economic incentives favor uniformity over diversity. Farmers choose varieties that produce consistent harvests and meet standardized market requirements. Food processing and distribution systems work best with crops that have uniform characteristics. Consumers often prefer the appearance and shelf life of modern varieties over traditional ones. International trade has accelerated genetic loss by spreading a few successful varieties worldwide while displacing local varieties that were adapted to specific environmental conditions. Globalization has created agricultural monocultures that span continents, making the entire food system vulnerable to the same risks. War, natural disasters, and political instability have destroyed seed collections and agricultural knowledge in many regions. Countries facing conflict often lose their agricultural genetic resources along with their capacity to maintain food security. The loss of genetic diversity becomes both a cause and consequence of social instability. That's when Swiss agricultural scientists proposed something that seemed both essential and impossibly ambitious: create a genetic backup system that could preserve humanity's agricultural heritage and provide the genetic resources needed to adapt crops to an uncertain future. The proposal faced criticism from multiple directions. Some argued that resources would be better spent on immediate hunger relief rather than long-term genetic preservation. Others questioned whether frozen seeds could really remain viable for the centuries needed to justify the enormous investment. But Swiss planners had compelling arguments for building the world's most secure seed storage facility. Switzerland's political neutrality provided security from international conflicts. Alpine geology offered natural protection from earthquakes, floods, and other disasters. The country's technological expertise could ensure optimal storage conditions for genetic materials. Most importantly, the genetic resources preserved in the vault could prove invaluable for adapting agriculture to climate change, developing disease-resistant crops, and maintaining food security as environmental conditions become increasingly unpredictable. The Alpine Seed Vault project officially launched in 2008 with goals that seemed almost fantastical: collect and preserve genetic samples from every crop variety humans have ever cultivated, create storage conditions that could maintain seed viability for 500+ years, and establish protocols for providing genetic resources to rescue failing crops worldwide. The construction of the Alpine Seed Vault required engineering precision that exceeded standards used for protecting nuclear materials or state treasures. Workers had to excavate chambers deep inside granite mountains, while maintaining environmental conditions that would preserve genetic materials for centuries. The excavation itself represented a feat of precision engineering in one of the world's most challenging environments. Tunnel-boring machines carved through alpine granite harder than concrete, creating underground chambers that would remain structurally stable for millennia. Every meter of excavation was mapped and analyzed to ensure the rock formations could provide permanent protection. The underground facility resembles a high-security laboratory crossed with a bank vault. Multiple airlocks prevent contamination from reaching seed storage areas. Backup power systems ensure continuous refrigeration, even during extended power outages. Emergency protocols include manual systems that could maintain storage conditions without any external support. But the real engineering challenge was creating storage conditions that could preserve seed viability across centuries. Traditional seed storage methods work for decades, but genetic preservation requires systems that function across geological timescales. Temperature control systems maintain exact conditions using redundant refrigeration equipment that operates continuously. Humidity management was equally critical. Even microscopic amounts of moisture could damage seeds over extended storage periods. Advanced dehumidification systems remove moisture from storage areas, while sealed containers provide additional protection for individual seed samples. Air quality control prevents contamination that could compromise genetic integrity. Filtration systems remove pollutants, pathogens, and any chemicals that could damage stored seeds. The air within storage areas is continuously monitored and maintained at optimal composition. Security systems exceed those used for protecting state secrets or strategic materials. Multiple authentication requirements control access to storage areas. Surveillance systems monitor every aspect of facility operations. International agreements ensure that genetic resources remain available for humanitarian purposes, regardless of political changes. Quality control during construction required testing every component to ensure performance across centuries. Storage containers underwent extreme temperature cycling to verify long-term integrity. Refrigeration systems were tested under failure conditions to ensure backup systems could maintain storage requirements. The seed collection process required unprecedented international cooperation as scientists worked to gather genetic samples from every agricultural region on Earth. Collection teams traveled to remote farming communities, indigenous territories, and agricultural research stations to obtain seeds representing the full spectrum of crop genetic diversity. Each seed sample underwent rigorous testing to verify genetic integrity and storage viability. DNA analysis confirmed genetic characteristics, while germination testing ensured seeds could produce viable plants after storage. Only samples meeting strict quality standards were accepted for long-term preservation. Documentation systems created comprehensive records for each seed variety, including genetic characteristics, growing requirements, traditional uses, and collection location. This information ensures that genetic resources can be effectively utilized when needed for crop improvement or disaster response. International agreements establish protocols for sharing genetic resources while respecting the rights of communities that developed and maintained crop varieties. Legal frameworks ensure that genetic benefits are shared fairly when preserved varieties are used for commercial crop development. The first seed deposits began in 2010 as countries around the world contributed genetic samples to the international collection. Agricultural research institutions, seed companies, and farming communities provided varieties representing thousands of years of crop development and adaptation. Initial operations focused on crops most vulnerable to genetic loss. Traditional varieties that were being abandoned as farmers adopted modern agricultural methods. Priority was given to varieties from regions experiencing political instability, climate change impacts, or rapid agricultural modernization that threatened genetic diversity. The collection process revealed the extent of genetic diversity that had already been lost. Researchers discovered that many traditional varieties existed in only a few locations, maintained by elderly farmers who had no successors interested in continuing traditional agricultural practices. But they also found unexpected genetic treasures, crop varieties with unique traits that could prove invaluable for future agriculture. Drought-tolerant wheats from arid regions, disease-resistant rice varieties from tropical areas, and cold-adapted potatoes from high-altitude communities all provided genetic resources that could be crucial for climate adaptation. By 2015, the Alpine Seed Vault contained over 2 million seed samples, representing genetic diversity from every agricultural region on Earth. The collection included varieties that had been lost from their original locations, but preserved through international seed exchanges and research programs. But the real test of the vault's value came when agricultural disasters struck, and scientists needed genetic resources to rescue failing crops. The facility's first major deployment would prove whether genetic preservation could actually prevent agricultural catastrophe. The most dramatic validation of the Alpine Seed Vault's importance came between 2016 and 2023, when a series of agricultural crises demonstrated that genetic preservation could literally save billions of people from food shortages. The seeds hidden beneath Swiss granite proved their worth by rescuing crops worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The first major deployment occurred in 2016, when wheat rust disease, a fungal pathogen that had been controlled for decades, evolved new strains that threatened wheat crops across multiple continents. Traditional fungicides proved ineffective against the evolved pathogen, and crop failures in major wheat-producing regions created food security emergencies. Agricultural scientists turned to the Alpine Seed Vault for genetic solutions. The vault contained thousands of wheat varieties with natural resistance genes that had been bred out of modern commercial varieties in favor of higher yields. Within months, researchers had identified genetic traits that could provide resistance to the new rust strains. Emergency breeding programs using vault genetics developed resistant wheat varieties that prevented crop failures that could have affected food supplies for over 2 billion people. The economic value of prevented losses exceeded $50 billion, while the human cost of avoided famine was incalculable. The success triggered massive international investment in genetic preservation, as governments recognized that seed vaults could provide critical resources for agricultural emergencies. Countries that had been skeptical about genetic preservation launched their own vault construction programs based on the Swiss model. A second major deployment came in 2018, when climate change-related drought created agricultural emergencies across sub-Saharan Africa. Traditional crop varieties failed as precipitation patterns shifted and temperatures exceeded historical ranges. Millions of people faced food shortages as staple crops could no longer survive in altered environmental conditions. The vault provided drought-tolerant varieties of sorghum, millet, and other traditional African crops that had been collected from arid regions but were no longer widely cultivated. These varieties contained genetic adaptations developed over thousands of years that allowed survival under extreme drought conditions. International agricultural development programs used vault genetics to establish drought-resistant crops that maintained food security in regions where climate change had made traditional agriculture impossible. The genetic resources prevented humanitarian crises that could have required massive international food aid programs. Rice production faced a similar crisis in 2020, when rising sea levels caused saltwater intrusion in major rice-growing deltas across Asia. Traditional rice varieties couldn't tolerate increased soil salinity, threatening food security for populations that depended on rice as their primary staple. The Alpine Seed Vault contained salt-tolerant rice varieties that had been developed in coastal regions, but largely replaced by higher-yielding varieties that couldn't survive saline conditions. Emergency breeding programs used these genetic resources to develop new rice varieties that could maintain production despite saltwater contamination. The success prevented food shortages that could have affected over 500 million people, while demonstrating that genetic preservation could provide solutions to climate change impacts that were just beginning to affect global agriculture. Disease outbreaks continued testing the vault's resources as agricultural pathogens evolved to overcome crop resistances. Coffee rust disease threatened global coffee production, but vault genetics provided resistance genes that maintained production in major coffee-growing regions. Banana crops faced extinction from Panama disease, but genetic resources preserved in seed vaults provided the diversity needed to develop resistant varieties. Without genetic preservation, entire agricultural industries could have been lost to evolving pathogens. The economic impact of genetic preservation became undeniable as prevented crop losses exceeded $200 billion between 2016 and 2023. Insurance companies began offering reduced premiums for agricultural operations that used genetically diverse crops rather than monocultures vulnerable to single disasters. International recognition grew as the United Nations declared genetic preservation a critical component of global food security. The success of crop rescue operations demonstrated that seed vaults were not just academic exercises, but practical tools for preventing humanitarian disasters. Research collaboration expanded globally as universities established programs studying how genetic resources could address climate change impacts on agriculture. Students from around the world traveled to Switzerland to study techniques that were becoming essential for future food security. The technological innovations developed for genetic preservation found applications beyond agriculture. Cryogenic storage techniques proved relevant for medical research and biotechnology. Genetic analysis methods enhanced plant breeding programs and conservation biology efforts. But perhaps most importantly, the success changed how humanity approaches agricultural planning. Instead of focusing only on maximizing current production, agricultural policies began incorporating genetic diversity as essential infrastructure for long-term food security. International development programs shifted towards supporting agricultural diversity rather than promoting uniform high-yield varieties. Farmers were encouraged to maintain traditional varieties alongside modern crops to preserve genetic resources while meeting current production needs. Climate change adaptation strategies increasingly relied on genetic diversity as the primary tool for maintaining agricultural productivity under changing environmental conditions. Seed vault networks became critical infrastructure comparable to strategic petroleum reserves or military defense systems. Today, the Alpine Seed Vault operates as humanity's genetic insurance policy against agricultural catastrophe. The facility continues receiving seed deposits from around the world while providing genetic resources for ongoing crop improvement and emergency response efforts. Scientists work continuously to characterize genetic resources and identify traits that could prove valuable for future agricultural challenges. Advanced genomic techniques allow precise identification of beneficial genes that can be transferred to modern crop varieties through breeding programs. The Vault has inspired similar facilities worldwide, creating a global network of genetic preservation that ensures agricultural diversity will survive even catastrophic disasters. Each facility specializes in particular crops or regions while contributing to comprehensive global coverage. Research continues on improving storage techniques and extending seed viability periods. Cryogenic preservation methods could potentially maintain genetic resources for thousands of years, ensuring that agricultural diversity remains available across geological timescales. The underground chambers that once seemed like elaborate insurance policies have proven their value through repeated agricultural emergencies. The seeds preserved beneath Alpine granite have become critical resources for maintaining human civilization in an era of rapid environmental change. From agricultural insurance policy to active emergency resource, from genetic museum to crop rescue operation, from Swiss mountain fortress to global food security infrastructure. The Alpine Seed Vault demonstrates that preserving biological diversity today could determine whether humanity thrives tomorrow. The millions of seeds hidden beneath granite mountains represent humanity's commitment to future generations, ensuring that the genetic resources needed to feed the world will remain available regardless of what environmental changes the future brings. What other biological resources do you think humanity should be preserving as insurance policies against uncertain futures?